And what kind of rate of decline are we looking at, and what kind of rate of acceleration are we looking at for, well, I suppose, what would you say, people demographically from, where is it? I don't know, sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East?
Well, let's take those two questions separately.
Yeah.
So what's the speed of the decline and where are people coming from? In terms of the speed of the decline, there was work done by demographers at Oxford. There's been other work more recently that looks at 2060, where we'll have perhaps 50 to 60% of people defining themselves as white British. But of course, at that point, if you look at the primary school or the school-age folk or the people in the large cities, it would be a minority and a declining minority.
And that's by what year, we think?
That's by 2050, 2060.
So by 2050 or 2060, a relatively educated guess, or a very educated guess, as to what British primary schools will look like would have white British in the minority?
Yes, I would think so, and the country as a whole, a bare majority. Of course, there is an issue of self-definition in the census, but that's broadly where it will be. Now, in terms of where people are coming from, exactly as you've already said, there has been a shift from EU immigrants to non-EU immigrants, and that's partly because of Brexit, but there's something else going on which I think is being missed, which is that there's declining fertility rates, not only here, which is part of the sucking movement to bring immigrants in, which I'd like to talk about a bit more, but also in places like Poland. So look at the 20-somethings in Poland who would have upsticked in the 90s, 2010s, 2010s. It's falling off a cliff. Poland's had a long period of very low fertility. Their living standards are rising, so their economic motives to come here are narrowing, and there are fewer and fewer of them, and they're more and more needed at home. So even if we wanted more EU immigration, I think we'd find it increasingly difficult to get it.
I think it was a big thing of Brexit. Anyone who thought that voting for Brexit would mean that there would be fewer foreign people / people of a different skin tone to Western Europeans was fundamentally misguided. But I do also think that most people thought we would have greater control of our borders, and therefore we possibly wouldn't be in a situation like the one we're talking about now, which is that we could have a net migration of a million figure, which I think by anyone's stretch of the imagination is absolutely bonkers, really. So you would expect our major cities to be, what, predominantly, would you say, identifying as, what, Muslim, maybe?
Well, there'll be a very lot. I mean, each city will be different. There is a growing element which is Muslim, but the Muslims themselves come from very varied backgrounds. I think there are a number of things going on here, and people get a bit confused. There is the fact that the master's student and the general student industry has grown enormously means we have a very, very large number of people coming in. Many leave, not all of them. And you've talked about their dependence. But I think more important is the fact that there is this huge demand for labour. Our economy is barely growing, and yet we have this huge demand for labour. Sector after sector is crying out to the government to let in workers in their sector. And the reason for that is that for 50 years, we haven't had enough children to replace ourselves. And that problem will only that sucking noise from industry after industry will only really change when our own fertility rate goes back above.
Now, this is something that I'm very interested in, because I think that traditionally in this country there was a very regimented way of doing things, the proper, quote-unquote, proper way of doing things, which was to find someone, get married, property ownership, breed, OK? And clearly now I think the housing market is having a massive, massive block on people wanting to start families and feeling as though they're able to afford that. But the fertility rate is different, I believe, in different demographies, isn't it? Demographics. Why is that? What is that?
Well, I think you have to be very careful before blaming the cost of housing or the cost of childcare. There's no doubt that if it were easier to start a family, to buy a house and to find some means of childcare in a world where we expect both members of a couple to work, the fertility rate would go up. But if you actually look at the parts of the country where housing is quite cheap, or the parts of the country where childcare is more accessible. Or if you look at countries like Germany, where childcare is actually very cheap and very subsidised, they all have low fertility rates. So I think it goes well beyond the simple economics, although that's part of the story. I think it goes to a culture of antinatalism, and there is a new generation coming through the ranks in their 20s today who, I wouldn't say they dislike children or they're positively antinatal, but starting a family is not a priority for them.
Yeah.